So grainy. Okay, well, let's share the screen. All right, cool. So, the way I write about this in what is it, chapter 5, I think. Um, it's the end of an era and the beginning of another era. Now, like the era had been wrapping up for a few decades, but like it's clear by the turn of the 19th, 20th century, um, the future is a technological one, right? That had been the case for the whole entirety of the 1800s, right? The train transforming life for people in Europe and America, but then around the world. I mean, there's train tracks built all over the place by 1900. Um, but towards the end of that century, right, that's we're start getting like electrification. I mean, that's a pretty crazy change in technology. Even just thinking about like working at night, right? Like we're having a night class. They didn't used to have night classes before we had light bulbs. Like it'd be expensive, a lot of candles or oil lamps or whatever you're using to illuminate something. And then it's not very good light either, right? It's nice and cozy, but it's not great if you're trying to like paint a wall or clean something really well or even write physically. So I was thinking a little bit about then and now, right? 123 years ago and 2023. And there's so many similarities. It's called the progressive era because of particularly a group of people. Not all directly connected. It wasn't like they were all working together, but they were all kind of part of a similar movement, a wave of progress, of reform, of trying to change all of these new problems that have popped up because of industrialization. Um, Drunkenness did used to be a problem, but not like it was after industrialization, right? Like alcoholism becomes such a bigger deal, and it's so much more destructive in a world like this than it is if you're a farmer and you're living on a farm. Um, even like education, right? So we kind of think of education as a foregone conclusion in the developed society that's what a developed society would do is educate people. Um, that was very optional, before the 1900s. There wasn't mandatory public school in a lot of places. And, if there was education, it was like the church's job. So there were schools, but they'd usually be like parochial schools attached to a church or parish or something like that. And then like child neglect. Um, that's not to say that children were not neglected or treated poorly on the farm, but they were around people, particularly adults, their parents, all the time. Even if they're off by themselves in the field, their parents are not, they're within earshot usually, and they're not interacting with anybody else. There's no strangers. Strangers don't wander onto the farm. But man, in a place where it's like you can't afford to be a farmer anymore, or you're an immigrant family, you don't own land, going to school is not really a thing necessarily. You kind of have to pay for going to school. And both your parents have to work factory jobs. And they're like 14-hour a day factory jobs, right? It's not 8 hours, it's all day. And you're going to go start working a factory job basically as soon as you can. So it's not uncommon to find like 8, 9-year-old kids in factories, which of course there's all kinds of hazards and danger there. But then also like children just aren't being raised by people the way they have been forever. So man, I mean, there's so many problems that are coming up from this new way of life. Even worker safety, right? Previously, if you were a factory owner, like say in 1800, it's a small factory. It's like you got a couple employees, right? You're maybe you're building shoes, but they're still like cobbling them together, and you're the owner, and you're like on a one-on-one name basis with all your employees. You know, like you'll know their birthdays. You guys are probably all the same religion, so you have all the same saints days off and stuff. So it's a lot different when it gets to like 100 years later factories. They're huge, right? They're often employing hundreds of people. Um, they're highly mechanized, so there's machines. It's dangerous, and the owner is not going to be in there. You're never going to meet the owner. The manager is going to be in there, and they don't really give two flying flips what happens to you. If you get hurt on the job, BFD. They'll find another chump that just got off the bus to, crank the lever or push the button or do whatever. It's like they've taken a lot of the skill out of the task, so you're easy to replace. In the old system, workers aren't easy to replace. It's going to be expensive for you, even if you don't have to pay for their medical expenses or injuries or any of that stuff. So worker safety is like a huge problem across the board, all kinds of places, factories, mines, transportation. So this is really when we start getting the calls for like social safety nets, right? Like unemployment insurance, workers' compensation. Those aren't really going to come into effect nationally until Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal during the 1930s. Social Security, old age insurance essentially is what it is. Medical insurance, we're still trying to work that one out. It seems insane to me that we don't just have free medical care for everybody. Like, seriously, like we can just work. Our system wouldn't cost more than what we're paying right now. It's just wild. It's crazy to me, especially that so many other countries have it. Yeah.
How did that come to be, though, that the US has a system very much
Yeah, good question. So why is America like that when so many other countries that we're very similar to in a lot of ways, but then differ on some significant ones like that? The short answer is the American Medical Association. Truman tried to pass universal health care in the 1940s, and the lobbyist of doctors basically petitioned against it because they could make more money if it's privatized. And it's come up over and over and over again, and it just keeps getting hacked to pieces or just outright not voted through. The longer answer, it relates to communism. So a lot of people have wondered, they've asked this question, like, why did socialism take root in Europe and not in America? Because in so many ways, America is a very European society, right? I mean, it was colonized by Europeans, like we are a colony of Europe. And so, capitalism took off well here, and it did good in all the European countries. But socialism has struggled to gain a lot of momentum. I would say one part of that answer is that capitalism maybe took a firmer root in America than anywhere else because we didn't have like the lords and dukes and all of that, right? So it was able to sink its teeth in more, and then the rich and powerful they're capitalist rich and powerful. The European ones are like, they're rich and powerful because their families have been rich and powerful for centuries, right? It's because they own a lot of land. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant. He didn't have much. Like, he was kind of a regular dude who becomes one of the richest people in the world. And they're very against any kind of socialist redistribution of wealth at all. Where the lords and dukes and all of those nobilities, there's a term, noblesse oblige. It means like it's the duty of the lord to take care of his people. So ideally, like taxes back in the day, it used to look like, okay, here's the like little duke, and he owns all this land that a bunch of people live on and farm, and but they have to give him a bumper part of their crop every year. It's taxes, right? But the taxes aren't just for him to get rich. It's he's supposed to be storing all of that grain in a silo so that when there's famine, the state can provide, right? So it's like an element of a safety net there. Of course, you also owe your fidelity to go fight and battle for him anytime he calls you up to do so. And you don't really get a say in the matter. The government can do that today still. But I think in America, we've got this idea that the government shouldn't be interfering with people's lives, right? Um, we're all about that in America. But healthcare is interfering with our lives, just in a good way, right? And it's interfering other people because it's taxing them. But
My country, Brazil,
Yeah.
The health is free or
right in Brazil, which is like not as developed as America is,
no,
right?
no, yeah.
I mean,
I'm
Developing
not saying that
faster.
there's better than here, no, but
no, but you got better healthcare.
yeah.
I mean, China's
in
free
this
healthcare.
point, I think Brazil.
Yeah, Canada does. I mean, geez, a lot of countries have free universal healthcare now. It's not just like Denmark, it's like Brazil and China and all over the place.
How did it, like, the health insurance, like, how did it?
Well, how did insurance become more expensive over time? Yeah,
Kind of simple economics, because we pay for it for all taxpayers, from private insurance agency. As the US dollar loses value and inflation rises, we have a
yeah, and like healthcare's gotten infinitely more complicated, right? In 1900, there's no x-rays. Like you're not going to pay an x-ray technician bill when you break your arm because they don't have them, right? They don't have all the medicines that we have nowadays. They have MRI machines and all these different specialized surgeons and then just like most other organizations, whether it's a for-profit business or a large like university or college or a hospital, the administration costs are just, if you look over the well, let me see if I can find a slide actually. From a few years ago. Oh, come on, what kind of article doesn't have a graph in it? Seriously. Okay, here we go. Healthcare administration. So the amount of money spent on administration in healthcare has gone up 1,500% since the 70s. Like, wow. And so much of that, it's like HR, right? Like HR departments are way bigger now. It's so bureaucratic, it's so wasteful and like unnecessary, and it makes the expense of everything go way up. Yeah, it's the same thing at like large corporations too. So, yeah, like we just don't, and I think because America didn't have the feudal system with the lords and the peasants, right? There is less of a sense of class consciousness in America, right? So like Europeans that aren't nobility all know they are not, and they've been aware of that for centuries, right? And occasionally they would rise up and revolt and storm the castle, overthrow a lord, have a French Revolution and decapitate everybody. Like we've never done anything close to that in America. And the American Revolution was definitely not one of class, right? It was the wealthy class here fighting the wealthy of Britain, um, and using the poor to do it. Like that's how wars work. So we don't have that whole sense of class identity, nor an expectation of the government to like take care of its people. You know, like Europeans, they talk about nobility like, oh, we're their children and they're our parents. Like that's how the British people like think of the Queen. I don't know if they think of the king that way. He's kind of hard to love, but yeah, so I mean this makes a huge difference. And so in the 1800s, in like the 1840s, 50s, 60s, Europe is there's revolutions all over in all the different countries and states of Europe. There are like wild revolutions, and they're all class based. Communism, the Communist Manifesto is like it's making ripple waves. But that doesn't happen in America. Like Europe is kind of mired in their own internal conflicts, while America's just figuratively and literally pushing the pedal to the floor, just gassing it, right? Like our economy is just exploding. Immigration's still exploding. I mean, we're growing by leaps and bounds every decade. So it's like less. Don't think about that. The wheels are in motion. Where things are different in Europe, and will remain so leading up to World War II. I think maybe like right now as well. Uh, this is, it's at the turning point from one world system to another, right? And so we're now a couple decades deep into the internet, smartphone, AI, electric car, revolution. Where at this point in 1900, they're a couple decades deep into the automobile, gas-powered engine, electricity, moving images, paved streets, revolution. And really, it's like, one way of life is done with. Like it's over by 1900. Like it would be a wild time to live through. I mean, truly, like the amount of transformation that happens to society is, I think we actually can we've got a taste for maybe what that's like. I don't know though. I mean, like I'm 41, so I feel like I've got a good handle on that because I lived like a solid 2 decades in the old one, like the life was really different before the internet. And it didn't feel wildly different when the internet came around because the internet was kind of stupid at the beginning, right? It was like nobody knew what to do. They're in chat rooms and like sending Nigerian princes money and just, like eBay came out. That was kind of cool, but it was not anything like what it is now. And that happened slowly over 2, 3 decades. So I feel like I've got a good gauge on like, wow, life was just that different. Where, yeah, somebody born in like the 1880s, they might feel the same way, or the 1870s in America about how kind of transformational everything is at this time. What I was trying to pull up in the book, but I'm not having luck with, is, in 1900, I have a whole section in there about the World's Fair, in Paris. It's like this just marvelous like event. I would have loved to have gone to that. The one I think it's in 1893 in Chicago, like the Columbian Fair, I think is what they called it that year to celebrate 400 years, 400 years since Columbus discovered America. Which is like where Thomas Edison premiered the motion picture camera, right? Like that would have been just a really cool event to be at. The 1900 one would have as well. I go into like detail on Campbell's soup, right? Like that's how, like that's this thing, and it's like, ooh, wow, like wowing people at the fair of like, got soup in a can. That's It's pretty revolutionary. I mean, it seems so insignificant to us these days. But it is very representative of like the outlook that people had in 1900. So, I mean, imagine living in 1900 and not knowing that there's going to be two giant world wars and atomic bombs and communism and the Cold War and the Twin Towers. Like, none of that is happening because it's in the future. It's not set. You're just in 1900 and you're a 20-year-old college student in 1900. You'd be like, hey, life is looking pretty good. Like, things are improving rapidly. Like, cars they're pretty cool. People seem to be liking those. It's not going to be commercialized yet, but people are beginning to make breakthroughs in radio and like microphones and sound. So, you know, the cylinder recording device that Edison, you know, patents, that was so wild to people that you could record sound and play it. It wasn't used for music at first. I mean, speakers weren't even really a thing. It was those like big horn, you know, like things sticking off the crank gramophone. So yeah, you know, sound quality wasn't great. They would record messages to their family, like for the future, for when they're dead. Like, oh, you can hear grandma from the grave. Like, that's just crazy, and we take that for granted. You know, if most of us have some video or audio of our older relatives, but that was just not a thing. And man, it's kind of like that's what people did very early on with photography. They quick get a picture of the person they just died. We want to be able to remember what they look like, even if they're dead and creepy as hell. You know, like, oh, especially like the pictures of like kids. I'm like, oh, this is just horrifying and disturbing. But you know, I think people were pretty disturbed back then. So yeah, like this, there's an optimism about things. And so I think progressive people are like, hey, like we can use the federal government to enact progressive changes for our society. So I mean, they do that. They are actively like petitioning state, local, federal government agencies to pass changes or to create new agencies to, you know, control some of these problematic areas. And I think, you know, today most people that identify as progressive are typically like anti-war. Most of the progressives of this era were not. Like when World War II rolled around, they're like, we got to get on that bandwagon because it will empower the federal government. And then we can use that power to push through all these changes. So they did do that. It empowered the federal government, but they didn't do a lot of the progressive changes. By the time the war had come around, most of the things that these folks accomplished had already come to pass. So yeah, if we're looking at, you know, population wise, 76 million people when the Constitution was enacted, we were like 2.5, you know, so that's in a little bit over 100 years, that's a lot of growth. I mean, that's unreal growth for any country, really. This is one of those things that does make America significant in its own right. Let's roll with this. This will give us a good.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about progressives. No, Stan, Progressives, yes. You know, like these guys who used to want to bomb the means of production, but also less radical progressives.
Mr. Green, are we talking about like Tumblr progressives where it's half discussions of misogyny and half high contrast images of pizza? Because if so, I can get behind that.
Me from the past, your anachronism is showing your internet was green letters on a black screen. But no, the progressive era was not like Tumblr. However, I will argue that it did indirectly make Tumblr and therefore JLog gift sets possible, so that's something. So some of the solutions that progressives came up with to deal with issues of inequality and injustice don't seem terribly progressive today, and also it kind of overlapped with the Gilded Age, and progressive implies like progress, presumably progress toward freedom and justice, which is hard to argue about an era that involved one of the great restrictions of freedom in American history, prohibition. So maybe we shouldn't call it the progressive era at all. Stan, whatever, roll the intro. So if the Gilded Age was the period when American industrial capitalism came into its own and people like Mark Twain began to criticize its associated problems, then the progressive era was the age in which people actually tried to solve those problems through individual and group action. As the economy changed, progressives also had to respond to a rapidly changing political system. The population of the US was growing and its economic power was becoming ever more concentrated, and sometimes progressives responded to this by opening up political participation, and sometimes by trying to restrict the vote. The thing is, broad participatory democracy doesn't always result in effective government, he said, sounding like the Chinese National Communist Party. And that tension between wanting to have government for, of, and by the people and wanting to have government that's like good at governing kind of defined the progressive era, and also our era. But progressives were most concerned with the social problems that revolved around industrial capitalist society, and most of these problems weren't new by 1900, but some of the responses were. Companies, and later corporations, had a problem that had been around at least since the 1880s. They needed to keep costs down and profits high in a competitive market. And one of the best ways to do this was to keep wages low, hours long, and conditions appalling. Your basic house elf situation. Just kidding, house elves didn't get wages. Also, by the end of the 19th century, people started to feel like these large monopolistic industrial combinations, the so-called trusts, were exerting too much power over people's lives. The 1890s saw federal attempts to deal with these trusts, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, but overall, the federal government wasn't where most progressive changes were made. For instance, there was muckraking, a form of journalism in which reporters would find some muck and rake it. Mass circulation magazines realized they could make money by publishing exposés of industrial and political abuse, so they did. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? I bet it involves muck. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either correct or I get shocked. Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, and all the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid one by one. Of the butchers and floormen, the beef boners and trimmers, and all those who used knives, you could scarcely find a person who had the use of his thumb. Time and time again, the base of it had been slashed, till it was a mere lump of flesh against which the man pressed the knife to hold it. They would have no nails. They had worn them off, pulling hides. Wow. Well, now I am hyper aware of and grateful for my thumbs. They are just in excellent shape. I am so glad, Stan, that I am not a beef boner at one of the meat packing factories written about in the jungle by Upton Sinclair. No shock for me! Oh, Stan, I can only imagine how long and hard you've worked to get the phrase beef boner into this show, and you finally did it. Congratulations. By the way, just a little bit of trivia. The Jungle was the first book I ever read that made me vomit. So that's a review. I don't know if it's positive, but there you go. Anyway, at the time, readers of The Jungle were more outraged by descriptions of rotten meat than by the treatment of meatpacking workers. The Jungle led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. That's pretty cool for Upton Sinclair, although my books have also led to some federal legislation, such as the which officially declared Hazel and Augustus the nation's OTP. So to be fair, writers have been describing the harshness of industrial capitalism for decades, so muckraking wasn't really that new, but the use of photography for documentation was. Louis Hine, for instance, photographed child laborers in factories and mines, bringing Americans face to face with the more than 2 million children under the age of 15 working for wages, and Hine's photos helped bring about laws that limited child labor. But even more important than the writing and photographs in magazines when it came to improving conditions for workers was Twitter. What's that? There was no Twitter? Still? What is this, 1812? All right, so apparently still without Twitter, workers had to organize into unions to get corporations to reduce hours and raise their pay. Also, some employers started to realize on their own that one way to mitigate some of the problems of industrialization was to pay workers better. Like in 1914, Henry Ford paid his workers an average of $5 per day, unheard of at the time. Whereas today I pay Stan and Danica 3 times that, and still they whine. Ford's reasoning was that better paid workers would be better able to afford the Model Ts that they were making, and indeed, Ford's annual output rose from 34,000 cars to 730,000 cars between 1910 and 1916, and the price of a Model T dropped from $700 to $316. Still, Henry Ford definitely forgot to be awesome sometimes. He was anti-Semitic, he used spies in his factory, and he named his child Edsel. Also, like most employers at the turn of the century, he was virulently anti-union. So while the AFL was organizing the most privileged industrial workers, another union grew up to advocate for rights for a larger swath of the workforce, especially the immigrants who dominated unskilled labor, the industrial workers of the world. They were also known as the Wobblies, and they were founded in 1905 to advocate for, quote, every wage worker, no matter what his religion, fatherland, or trade, and not, as the name Wobblies suggests, just those fans of wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey. The Wobblies were radical socialists. Ultimately, they wanted to see capitalism and the state disappear in revolution. Now, most progressives didn't go that far, but some, following the ideas of Henry George, worried that economic progress could produce a dangerous, unequal distribution of wealth that could only be cured by taxes. But more progressives were influenced by Simon W. Patton, who prophesied that industrialization would bring about a new civilization where everyone would benefit from the abundance and all the leisure time that all these new labor-saving devices could bring. This optimism was partly spurred by the birth of a mass consumption society. I mean, Americans by 1915 could purchase all kinds of newfangled devices like washing machines or vacuum cleaners, automobiles, record players. It's worth underscoring that all this happened in a couple generations. I mean, in 1850, almost everyone listened to music and washed their clothes in nearly the same way that people did 10,000 years ago. And then, boom. And for many progressives, this consumer culture, to quote our old friend Eric Foner, became the foundation for a new understanding of freedom, as access to the cornucopia of goods made available by modern capitalism. And this idea was encouraged by new advertising that connected goods with freedom, using liberty as a brand name or affixing the Statue of Liberty to a product. By the way, Crash Course is made exclusively in the United States of America, the greatest nation on earth, ever. That's a lie, of course, but you're allowed to lie in advertising. But in spite of this optimism, many progressives were concerned that industrial capitalism, with its exploitation of labor and concentration of wealth, was limiting rather than increasing freedom, depending on how you define freedom, of course. Industrialization created what they referred to as the labor problem, as mechanization diminished opportunities for skilled workers and the supervised routine of the factory floor destroyed autonomy. The scientific workplace management advocated by efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor required rigid rules and supervision in order to heighten worker productivity. So if you've ever had a job with a defined number of bathroom breaks, that's why. Also, Taylorism found its way into classrooms, and anyone who's ever had to sit in rows for 45-minute periods punctuated by factory-style bells knows that this atmosphere is not particularly conducive to a sense of freedom. Now, this is a little bit confusing because while responding to worker exploitation was part of the progressive movement, so was Taylorism itself, because it was an application of research, observation, and expertise to the vexing problem of how to increase productivity. And this use of scientific experts is another hallmark of the progressive era, one that usually found its expression in politics. American progressives, like their counterparts in the green sections of Not America, sought government solutions to social problems. Germany, which is somewhere over here, pioneered social legislation with its minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and old age pension laws. But the idea that government action could address the problems and insecurities that characterize the modern industrial world also became prominent in the United States. And the notion that an activist government could enhance rather than threaten people's freedom was something new in America. Now, progressives pushing for social legislation tended to have more success at the state and local level, especially in cities, which established public control over gas and water and raised taxes to pay for transportation and public schools. Whereas federally, the biggest success was like prohibition, which, you know, not that successful. But anyway, if all that local collectivist investment sounds like socialism, it kind of is. I mean, by 1912, the Socialist Party had 150,000 members and had elected scores of local officials, like Milwaukee Mayor Emil Seidel. Some urban progressives even pushed to get rid of traditional democratic forms altogether. A number of cities were run by commissions of experts or city managers who would be chosen on the basis of some demonstrated expertise or credential rather than their ability to hand out turkeys at Christmas or find jobs for your nephew's sister's cousin. Progressive editor Walter Lippmann argued for applying modern scientific expertise to solve social problems in his 1914 book Drift and Mastery, writing that scientifically trained experts, quote, could be trusted more fully than ordinary citizens to solve America's deep social problems. This tension between government by experts and increased popular democratic participation is one of the major contradictions of the progressive era. The 17th Amendment allowed for senators to be elected directly by the people rather than by state legislatures, and many states adopted primaries to nominate candidates, again taking power away from political parties and putting it in the hands of voters. And some states, particularly Western ones like California, adopted aspects of even more direct democracy: the initiative, which allowed voters to put issues on the ballot, and the referendum, which allows them to vote on laws directly. And lest you think that more democracy is always good, I present you with California. But many progressives wanted actual policy made by experts who knew what was best for the people, not the people themselves. And despite primaries and direct elections of senators, it's hard to argue that the progressive era was a good moment for democratic participation, since many progressives were only in favor of voting insofar as it was done by white, middle-class Protestant voters. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Progressives limited immigrants' participation in the political process through literacy tests and laws requiring people to register to vote. Voter registration was supposedly intended to limit fraud and the power of political machines. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar, but it actually just suppressed voting generally. Voting gradually declined from 80% of male Americans voting in the 1890s to the point where today only about 50% of eligible Americans vote in presidential elections. But an even bigger blow to democracy during the progressive era came with the Jim Crow laws passed by legislatures in southern states, which legally segregated the South. First, there was the deliberate disenfranchisement of African Americans. The 15th Amendment made it illegal to deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but said nothing about the ability to read, so many southern states instituted literacy requirements. Other states added poll taxes, requiring people to pay to vote, which effectively disenfranchised a large number of African American people who were disproportionately poor. The Supreme Court didn't help. In 1896, it made one of its most famous bad decisions, Plessy versus Ferguson, ruling that segregation in public accommodations, in Homer Plessy's case, a railroad car, did not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. As long as black railroad cars were equal to white ones, it was a-okay to have duplicate sets of everything. Now, creating two sets of equal quality of everything would get really expensive, so southern states didn't actually do it. Black schools, public restrooms, public transportation opportunities, the list goes on, would definitely be separate and definitely not equal. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, of course, as we've seen, progressive ideas inspired a variety of responses, both for Taylorism and against it, both for government by experts and for direct democracy. Similarly, in the progressive era, just as the Jim Crow laws were being passed, there were many attempts to improve the lives of African Americans. The towering figure in this movement to uplift black Southerners was Booker T. Washington, a former slave who became the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a center for vocational education. And Washington urged Southern black people to emphasize skills that could make them successful in the contemporary economy. The idea was that they would earn the respect of white people by demonstrating their usefulness, and everyone would come to respect each other through the recognition of mutual dependence while continuing to live in separate social spheres. But Washington's accommodationist stance was not shared by all African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois advocated for full civil and political rights for black people and helped to found the NAACP, which urged African Americans to fight for their rights through, quote, persistent, manly agitation. So I wanted to talk about the progressive era today, not only because it shows up on a lot of tests, but because progressives tried to tackle many of the issues that we face today, particularly concerning immigration and economic justice, and they used some of the same methods that we use today: organization, journalistic exposure, and political activism. Now, we may use Tumblr or Tea Party forums, but the same concerns motivate us to work together. And just as today, many of their efforts were not successful because of the inherent difficulty in trying to mobilize very different interests in a pluralistic nation. In some ways, their platforms would have been better suited to an America that was less diverse and complex, but it was that very diversity and complexity that gave rise and still gives rise to the urge toward progress in the first place. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko.
He covers a lot in that video. So, and I know they're like fast paced. So it might be worth going back and watching again if it felt a little bit like drinking out of a fire hydrant. Um, two things. I want to go, if we're in 1900, I want to go back a few years and then forward a few years. Going back a few years, you know, he mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson, and it's in your book. I'm sure if you couldn't remember what it was about, you probably remember the name from high school history, because it's like one of the most important legal cases in the country's history. It establishes the separate but equal doctrine, which popped up in the South in the wake of the Civil War. They didn't need segregation before the Civil War because people were enslaved. And for the few free Black people that might be around, there was overwhelming white power to firmly suppress any notion of trying to, assert equality. But in the wake of the Civil War, with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, there's a legal path forward. There are advocates. There are people from the North that have come down into the South to govern. And until 1877, the federal government was all up in the South's business, and the army was all over the place. So there was protections. And in those years, there were dozens and dozens of Black people elected to not just like local or state government, but to the federal government as representatives and senators. That all gets rolled away once Reconstruction is over. And so once that is over, the idea of segregation and, okay, if we can't outright ban Black people from certain spots or activities or transportation, we can segregate them, separate them off so we don't have to mix, and therefore we can continue this false air of superiority. But this is expensive. Like segregation, I mean, racism in general is costly. It's costly on a lot of different levels. But think if you're operating a train and you've got 4 rail cars on it, and all of a sudden you have to add 2 more because you can't let any Black people ride on those 4 rail cars, like it's going to cost more. And it's like, ooh, that's like big business wasn't necessarily in favor of this. And I think, to be fair about things today, I don't think big business still is too interested in this. Like everybody's putting, rainbow flags on their Twitter profiles for Pride Month because it's very like politically advantageous to do right now, right? Everybody wants to appear not racist at all, even if like internally. How many people in here have seen the Barbie movie? Oh man, more of you guys gotta go. It's so good. It's so good. Well, at one point, like when Ken and Barbie get out into the real world, Ken's trying to like get a job at some business or corporation. He's like, I'd like a job because of the patriarchy. And the guy's like, well, we don't do that anymore. That's not our thing. He says, I can't remember exactly how he phrases it. He's like, no, but like where the men are actually in charge. And he's like, okay, we do that. We're just better at hiding it now. It's like, ooh, burn. Dang, Barbie, dig deep. A lot of the systems they're still good old boy systems, and they favor, and it's, I think, probably overriding race and gender and sexuality is class. And I'm not alone in my assessment of that. Like at the end of his life, that was cut very short. Martin Luther King Jr. was like, he was planning I can't remember what it's called now. It was a march on poverty at Washington. He's like, oh, we've got problems in America. The underlying problem that's bigger than race is class. And that's where like the vast majority of our problems come from, is this class division and the higher classes dividing what should be a united class of people. Like we're all poor compared to the rich, like very, very poor. Even if you've got a nice house, you're still very poor compared to America's rich and wealthy. And your power is zilch. Like, this is a bummer. This is how it works. And if we had more of an identity of class consciousness, I think we'd steamroll over some of these problems a lot easier. But like, it's not just politicians driving that division. It's like the whole apparatus, right? It's cable news, it's internet trolls now, and social media. There's so many things that are like driving division that poor people should totally be united on, right? Like, somebody who's not making $1 million a year shouldn't be voting against universal health care. Like, that's insane to me that poor people vote against that. I'm like, what the actual fuck is wrong with you? You don't want to be able to go to the doctor for free. That's crazy. But like, our thinking machine apparatuses that like feed and tell society different segments what to think, a good chunk of them got you programmed thinking, no, that'll end America. That'll make everybody poor. That'll, all the millionaires will move out of the country. Well, it's fine with me. Bye. Yeah. So, I don't know. This is a very easy way to divide people by literally segregating them. And unfortunately, this will become the law of the land until it gets overturned in 1954 by Brown v. Board of Education, one of the other most important legal cases because they're connected. And so the NAACP, I even think in the video he had mentioned Du Bois. He's like a brilliant academic, first Black person to get a PhD in history from Harvard. He forms the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the corresponding newspaper that goes with it. The name's slipping my mind. It's not important. The NAACP, though, their whole approach was to fight against this and Plessy in courts. Like, they knew this is like, we have to do this and keep fighting and fight the winnable battles and take them to the highest courts we can to get these things reversed. And it takes decades, but eventually it's successful. Let's watch this.
After the Civil War, the United States embarked on an era of Reconstruction, during which the country grappled with the painful history of slavery. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution sought to eradicate the taint of slavery by outlawing it and guaranteeing black citizens equal treatment under the law and the right to vote. However, there was a lot of resistance to racial equality, particularly in the South. By the 1870s, Reconstruction had fizzled out, giving way to the Jim Crow era. Named after the minstrel show Jump Jim Crow, this period was defined by racial segregation laws passed by Southern states. Plessy v. Ferguson is the now infamous case in which the United States Supreme Court declared it constitutional for races to be kept separate. In 1892, Homer Plessy took a trip. He bought a first-class ticket, got onto the train, and settled in one of the coaches. The conductor told Plessy to move to a different coach, but he refused. So Plessy was thrown off the train and into a jail cell. Under an 1890 state law, railways within Louisiana were required to have, quote, equal but separate, unquote, coaches for black and white passengers. Anyone refusing to sit in the assigned coach could be fined $25 or imprisoned for up to 20 days. As a U.S. citizen who was 7/8 white and 1/8 black, Plessy argued that he was white and deserved to sit in the coach reserved for white passengers. However, under Louisiana law, Plessy was considered black. So Plessy was put on trial in state court for breaking the law by sitting in the wrong coach. At trial, Plessy argued that the law was unconstitutional, but the government disagreed. Judge Ferguson sided with the government. If convicted, Plessy would be sentenced to prison and charged a fine. Plessy asked the Louisiana Supreme Court to issue a writ of prohibition against Judge Ferguson to prevent him from enforcing the law. But the Louisiana Supreme Court found the law constitutional. So Plessy asked for a writ of error from the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the case to determine whether the Louisiana law requiring racially segregated railway coaches was constitutional. Writing for the majority, Justice Brown concluded that the law didn't violate the 14th Amendment. The amendment was designed to make everyone equal under the law, but it wasn't intended to eliminate distinctions based on race. The majority thought that political equality of the races wasn't compromised by segregation. State laws creating racially segregated facilities thus didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause if those facilities were, quote, separate but equal, unquote. Laws requiring segregation could be legitimate exercises of state police power, provided they were reasonable and based on good faith rather than racist motives. Here, Louisiana was simply respecting the fact that the two races preferred remaining segregated. In other words, it wasn't the law's job or even within the law's power to force the races to mix. The court also found that the 13th Amendment, which Plessy argued was violated by the Louisiana law, was a non-issue because the case had nothing to do with abolishing slavery or involuntary servitude. Therefore, the court affirmed the Louisiana Supreme Court's decision. In a powerful dissent, Justice Harlan found that the Louisiana law was discriminatory because it sought to keep black passengers from coaches reserved for white passengers. Harlan stated that the law was clearly intended to keep black people away from white people. This was a violation of civil rights. Harlan said the Constitution is colorblind, and so a state couldn't constitutionally deprive citizens of their rights based on their races. For Justice Harlan, the majority's decision was like the Supreme Court's infamous self-inflicted wound in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Harlan thought Plessy would foster animosity and basically predicted that it would be overturned. Harlan would have found the Louisiana law unconstitutional. It's worth noting, however, that as progressive as Justice Harlan's views were, he didn't believe in equal rights for all mankind. His dissent distinguished Chinese people, and he didn't quibble with the exclusion of the Chinese race from citizenship. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson justified racial discrimination in the United States based on the separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, Plessy was finally overturned by Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka.
It just seems crazy to me that, like, I don't know, people are that ignorant of, like, oh, you're a different race. Like, we're literally all humans. Like, I don't know, but I live in an enlightened era, I guess.
I would point out one of the judges before last said that the race is preferred at that way, which obviously, if you have someone bringing
Right.
who doesn't,
Right.
they're obviously saying this is lying.
Yeah. The crazy thing is Justice Harlan, he was a slave owner. Like he was a Southern slave owner, and he's like, yeah, this isn't good. This is not going to work out good. But then, of course, like, didn't have the same logical, like, follow through with other races of people, like Chinese people. Yeah.
It's interesting to point out how, like, the Supreme Court find an era of race like this is what it's based on.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like the Supreme Court really has more power than the president, because the president needs to Congress.
Yeah. The Supreme Court, they don't have to get approved by anybody. They are the ones. They're not voted in, right? They're appointed, and it's forever. It's for life. Like, I think technically you can impeach a Supreme Court justice, but yeah, I don't think it's ever been done. I mean, they might try to do it to Clarence Thomas, and they should, because that guy is, though, I don't know. The Supreme Court, it's so messed up. It's so political now. It's so, but yeah, I mean, even its whole history, though, it's riddled with, they've made the Dred Scott decision. They made the Fugitive Slave Act, right? The Supreme Court is really powerful. And it's just 9 people. Right? Like, you're just like the untouchable person in the land that swings so much power. I don't know what a better option would be than what we have. Like, and that's kind of the problem. It's like, well, this is messed up and it's all problematic and broken. But I don't know what else to do. Like, I don't want to move into like some military junta where it's like, okay, well, you go before 4 generals and they just decide and execute you right there. It's like when we look at justice systems or other parts of the world, they're pretty messed up too. And yet at the same time, like it is the foundation of our civilization. Like law is the foundation of it. So everything that operates the way it does is because of like the laws that have been set up to govern the land. Yeah. AI, it is wild though, because it's like, oh, those people like they set up something that's going to last for 60 years that will like destroy people's lives and communities and move the dial backwards on kind of the progress that had been made. Now, in saying all of that, I think for you, me, most people in this room, probably, hopefully everybody, we do look at that and just think like how nearsighted and like small-minded that is to think that way. But people's minds were smaller back then, not physically. Well, maybe, I don't know actually, but like their worldviews were smaller. They knew a lot less about the world, the universe, our own history, anthropology, right? Like people are coming out of hundreds of years of tradition and like locality, right? Like where you lived, you were very central to that place and you didn't go very far usually. You certainly weren't traveling around the world. Very, very few people ever did that before steamships. Because it was dangerous and expensive. And so on a human level, not on an American level, but like on a historical human level, the people that live on the other side of the hills, you can't trust them. You don't know them. They're not your friends. They could come over and rape and kill everybody. And sometimes they did that. You know what I mean? If you go back to like 10, 12,000 BCE, like when people are like, don't go around those folks, they're different than us. They weren't even being racist. It's like, oh, those are Neanderthals. Like they're actually like genetically different. Like they're not the same as, modern Homo sapiens are. They're not that wildly different, and they inbred with each other. Like, anybody find that out on your ancestry.com? You're all, oh snap, I got a little. Yeah, it's only from a few regions though, right? It's like Europe and like Central Asia, and I think like maybe North Africa. Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, he's one of the only people who's like 100%. I know. And basically it means that his family has inbreeding.
Yeah.
That there is no other way.
That's yeah, I mean it's weird. Like when you go back and you start thinking about humans that far back, okay, that is a very different world. And I think that has less to do with racism and more to do with like xenophobia and just fear in general, because everything's going to kill you all the time. You know what I mean? Like that's how people lived, and they were quite local. That's obviously changed a lot by 1896, but those changes are recent. And even if the folks alive didn't live in that world, like their parents and grandparents sort of did, right? So, like when Europeans are coming over to America from different countries, they like British people, they didn't used to be like, they're all white, they're on our team. They're like those German pigs, those stupid Scottish whores, like they were just like, all of these people suck. They're all bad. We're the best ones. We're God's favorite. And that's the like attitude that all of these countries carry with them into World War I. right? They're all, you know, in Europe, it's all white countries going off to fight each other. And they're all like, God loves us. We're the best country. Our bishop said so. He prayed for our army. Victory is assured. And then when nobody won the war and it just killed millions and millions of people and destroyed towns and villages and wiped entire families off the map, people were like, oh, hey, that Nietzsche guy was right. God is dead. And we did kill him, and his blood is on our hands right now. Because clearly all of their like beliefs in like their own special divine specialness, right? Kind of like own everybody's own manifest destiny. Turned out to not maybe be so divinely inspired after all. But that's the herd tribe mentality that really, I mean, I don't know that it ever worked, but it really doesn't work very well in modern nation state places, especially multi-ethnic, multinational places like America or the Soviet Union. It's, yeah, I mean, Russia's the big slice of the pie, but you know, they got a lot of ethnicities going on in that group, and it's a lot harder to even make statements like that when it's the whole group's mixed and different. Germany, you saw in the progressive era video, they were like one of the first places to put in some of these progressive reforms. And in a lot of ways, Germany was highly, highly progressive. They're probably the most progressive country on earth when the war broke out. Different progressive than we have today, though, because in 1869, 1870 is when Germany as a country formed. Before that, it was all just a bunch of little, you know, hamlets and duchies and, you know, a couple big states, but it wasn't unified. And it gets unified under Prussia, which is like the East German, like their military wing. So all the Hitler goose stepping and, you know, Nazis, that all really came out of Prussia, but that formed kind of like the national ethos, like how Germany started thinking of themselves. So they were conservative, but like on a military morality level. On other things, though, they were the forefront leaders of science and progress and even like progressive legislation. That's why Marx, who was German, thought for sure Germany will be where the communist revolution happens because they're the most advanced. Therefore, they're the closest to graduating from capitalism. But again, that was that like euphoric optimism of the turn of the century. Like with all these advances, everybody thought like this is gonna be great. Some people though didn't, and they started to have anxiety about what the world was becoming. And this is where I think maybe I mentioned this a few weeks ago. This is where like dystopian literature starts to first come out, and really like science fiction in general is born here, like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, really like dreaming about the future. But then some people seeing, oh, there's definitely a dark side to all this progress, and we might be walking blindly into this. And we did. Like the world definitely did. And I think now, you know, I think there's some optimism about the advances and changes in the world and society. Certain things have definitely been good in the last, you know, 5-10 years. I mean, the Me Too movement is hugely significant. Like the game has changed for society on that level. COVID was not great. Like democracy might be over with, like everywhere. I don't know. Like I think we're definitely more measured though, more cynical maybe than folks were before the Great War. But if you look at Europe, like in terms of belief systems and kind of society, it was very Christian before World War I. And it wasn't Christian the way America is with like mega churches and evangelicalism. Like that didn't exist. but everybody was like generally religious and generally Christian. But man, after the war's over, like religion and religious beliefs just plummet. Like secularization happens in Europe rapidly, and it doesn't in America. And that's another one of those big differences between like Europe and America. Religion increases significantly in the 1920s. It's the Scopes monkey trial. It's fundamentalism. And again in the 50s after World War II. And I think probably a piece of that at least has to do with the fact that America didn't suffer in the war. I mean, yeah, sure, there were some hard things. Americans did die, but it was there. Our cities weren't being bombed and like ripped apart, you know. So yeah, I think that's maybe a key difference between those two things here. Has anybody read The Jungle? It's actually a really good book. I mean, it's a little dry, but it's very interesting. It follows an immigrant family from Lithuania, Estonia. It's one of those countries, to Chicago in like 1900. And they the dad winds up working in the meatpacking industry, which is like the nationwide meatpacking industry. Like all of the meat in the country basically is processed in Chicago, which is crazy because 50 years before that, couldn't do that. They didn't even have refrigerated cars. Like the meat would go bad. Everybody had local butchers, and a lot of people like raise their own animals and butcher them themselves. You know, like even in like apartments, sometimes in cities, you have like people raising chickens out on the balcony and like just hacking them up in their kitchen, which is like I think most of us would be quite squirmish about that these days, but it was more commonplace. But you know, if you got bad meat, you could go to the butcher and be like, "What the heck, Frank? You gave me botulism," you know, like, and he'd have to answer for that. And if that happened a lot, like people would stop buying meat from Frank. But like in nationwide meat packing, the accountability is gone. Food prices do drop, right? Americans are eating more protein, but then as progress progresses, we're like, oh, we can grow these things a lot quicker, a lot faster, a lot fatter. Just let's pump them full of hormones, you know, and keep them in boxes all day. Like, oh, well, that doesn't feel like progress to me. That feels like the opposite of progress. You know, a very interesting thing to look at in terms of how society changes is the food industry. I mean, gosh, that is a wild change that takes place in the 20th century, from like meat packing to, you know, making like frozen deep frozen dinners and microwaves coming out and advent of fast food. But you know, it's a great expose. I mean, it's a good window into like the life of how an immigrant peasant would have lived around this time in like the city. Like Chicago's the place to be in 1900. So for like on a historical level, it's very fascinating that way. But for its own context, written in 1906? I thought it was 1903. I guess 1906. It's this eye-opening expose on like just how messed up this huge industry is and how you don't actually know what is in your sausage. And like there's a scene in the book where somebody's hand or arm gets like caught in the meat grinder and it goes in and they just keep casing the sausages. And Theodore Roosevelt reads this while he's eating breakfast at the White House and was like, we are doing something about this problem. And the Pure Food and Drug Act comes in, which is a double-edged sword, like all these progressive things. Like, oh, it is good because they do start regulating some of this and saying, no, you can't just let rats fall into the sausage grinder. And like, no, like the inspections, there's regulations, OSHA, like health and safety, workplace health and safety. that comes in. Those are good. I want those things regulated. But of course, it's more red tape, so it slows down the production and the profit of the company. But then even more so, they're regulating drugs, which is again good. Like I don't want somebody selling snake oil and saying it'll cure cancer. But I also am like, you guys are gonna tell people it's illegal to eat mushrooms? That seems insane. Like that just seems like they just grow. Like they're not even a manufactured drug. Like that's wild. They don't outlaw mushrooms for a long time, but
Actually, one of the fun facts about that is mushrooms, similar to marijuana, are one of the safest drugs because it physically cannot overdose. It's not a black overdose before you.
that's true. But last year, I was living in the tall apartment building behind like Don Sal's on the boulevard.
Yeah.
So I was living in there. I moved out in July. But I came back on New Year's Day and I'm like, what the heck? They're at the end of my hallway, there's a big window and it had been busted out. And so I'm like, asking my neighbors, like, I went down there, like, you weren't here last night? I'm like, no, why did I miss it? Apparently, like, one of my neighbor's guests got hopped up on shrooms. I'm sure there's probably something else involved too, because shrooms don't normally make people jump out windows. They don't. Like, but he thought a bear was chasing him. And so in his underwear, full speed down the hallway, busted out the window onto the ledge. And I was only on the second floor. So it's not like he's just standing out there and people are like, stop, go back inside. He's like, I'm gonna jump. They're like, don't do it. He's like, I never jumped. And he jumped and like broke his ankle and his wrist. And then, when he went to the hospital, apparently he showed up the next morning, like butt cheeks hanging out of a hospital gown with like the IV thing, just walked out of AV hospital. So, I don't know. Like, I'm like, that guy, those weren't regular shrooms. Or they were shrooms that are called cocaine. They're just like, yeah, like,
It's a normal day in Lancaster. We're not talking about.
dude, it so is. It so is. I kind of miss living on the boulevard because it was fun. I do. Like, I'm on like 2.5 acres now. I've got goats. It's boring. Like, yeah.
You can still get drugs.
Well, yeah,
You can still buy drugs.
for sure. But like, I don't have people jumping out windows. Like, you know what I mean? Like, but I also am like, I kind of had to get out of there because I lived on the boulevard for 2 years. And in 2 years, I'm like, dude, it's gotten way worse. Like, it was pretty bad when I moved in, but it was like every night. It was like, damn, gunshots are ringing out again. Like, it was crazy. I don't know. I just feel like there are people in America that live in nice little suburbs. We are not one of those peoples, okay? And I'm like, but like, people live in bubbles and they're unaware of like what places like the Antelope Valley are actually like. And it's like, oh, this isn't like, oh, we're heading in a bad direction. This is like, we are in a full-blown dystopia.
Yeah.
If you would have showed me pictures of this when I was a kid, I would have been like, oh, did Biff get a time machine and become president? Kind of a little bit, yeah. Like, you ever realize that in Back to the Future 2? Like, the Biff that becomes president, they modeled him on Donald Trump in 1989. Isn't that funny? I mean, if you look at him, you're like, oh, I kind of see that. Like, he's like this casino owning, real estate mogul that cheated his way to the top. It's like, well, I guess that is what happened. I don't know. I think, looking at not just America, but really any society and seeing them go through not trials, right? Like a hard time. 9/11 was a trial for us. It wasn't like a prolonged period of decay. It may have marked the beginning of a prolonged period of decay. But when you look at different civilizations and what happens when they like collapse, we've got all of the warning signs. And some societies that manage to avoid total collapse like that, it's like the French Revolution. Well, they wildly overhaul their government and society and pull themselves out of the fire.
Do you think ever America will get there, or will we go rehaul over everything to kind of recorrect our course?
I would like to say yes, but I don't think so.
That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and people are dumb. Like, people are just stupid and don't really, I mean, we don't really critically think about a lot of things.
We're not taught to.
We're not taught to at all. Like,
Sit in this class, do what you're told, listen when the bell rings, then you go to your next station. Very work.
say the pledge.
Like, say the pledge, it's all very, factory workers.
Yeah.
They do work just like
Yeah.
you want you to do not think that's not your job. Your job is to hit the button when the bell rings and do X, Y, and Z. Mhm.
Yeah. And well, one of the reasons we have kind of public school set up the way we do is because it was difficult to get farmer people to adopt a machine lifestyle. Like, people didn't like it. Ford was paying his workers $5 a day, and they were still quitting on droves because it was so monotonously boring and like personality stifling, right? Like, you might think of like being a farmer as like not very exciting, but you're so independent. You know what I mean? Like, you're a self-directed person. You're not part of some machinery system so much. And so people just really didn't like that. Like, we're not geared to live the way we live. But so if you take people when they're little and sit them in a row for 8 hours a day and give them monotonous, repetitive tasks, and you reward and punish them, and like you show them social advancement and all that, teach them the rules, and okay, by the time you're an adult, you're like, you know, you're kind of hardwired to do that, and you're told that's what's good, and everybody applauds you for that, and but it doesn't turn out critical thinking, you know, it really doesn't. And I mean, think about this too. Even if our education system, like our legal system, it's flawed, it's still better than a lot of other places for sure. And it's better than nothing, right? So it's better to be educated and be a monotonous robot than to be an uneducated monotonous robot. Because it's not like school's the only avenue that turns us into that, right? It's like, well, we just live in a society that's built that way. So one party, you know, or political orientation at least, tends to very much favor free higher education and educating people. Basically, I think, like, let everybody go to school for as long as they want. Everybody wants to get PhDs and they're free. Oh, that's cool. I don't have any problem with that. Most people do not want to get a PhD. It's pretty boring. Like, and it's a lot of writing. But you know, you want to get a master's degree? That's awesome. Like, we should pay for people to go as far as they want to. The other one is like calling, forgiving massive crippling student debt that didn't exist when like baby boomers went to college. And they're calling anybody that wants to get rid of that like a Satanist, basically. You're like, okay, so you guys are against educating people. That's interesting. Why would you be against educating people? Well, because like, I think both parties thrive on people being uneducated, but I think one thrives more.
Isn't it just like 10,000?
Yeah, I don't think it's like a full reset. It was like $10,000 or $20,000.
And it was for only people that, had previous been making payments for so long already on their loan debt. Because originally it was supposed to be qualified for 20,000, of course, that got overturned.
Yeah.
Overturned real quick. But it's like, okay, you already had been in debt for whatever that time frame was, and then making consecutive payments under the payment arrangement clause.
Right.
5 years, or I don't know, some very long amount, which, yes, great, that's still hopeful for some people, but, does not necessarily solve the problem. The issue.
Yeah, if you've got 200 grand in debt, BFD, 10 grand is, okay, your payment might drop like 40 bucks a month, like,
Right.
yeah,
It's one of the things that stems once again deeper down, because if you look at it, the fact that tuition costs, some astronomical amount. And then you're like, yeah, for you to go to college and get a better life, that's what you have to do, is go to debt. So that way you'll be paying that for the rest of your life. You're never really catching up or getting ahead.
yeah.
So although you're making more, are you truly making more because you're still in debt paying off the loan?
Well, and like, I hate to burst your bubble here, folks, but like, getting a college degree does not necessarily mean you're gonna make more money in life. Like, I would make more money as a plumber than as a teacher right now, today. Like,
But that was something we're all, at least in my generation.
well, and I think it
College,
used to be
college.
more true. I think that did used to be more true because so fewer people actually went to college. Like, having a high school diploma was like, oh, you'll make more money doing that. Now it's like you can't even get a job without a high school diploma. The Army won't even take you. Like, what do you need a high school diploma for in the Army? Like, can you read? Okay, you're in. Like, do you even need to know how to read? Probably not. Like, this, do jumping jacks, make your bed well, like, yeah, like, so then it was like, okay, if you get a bachelor's degree, you're like way ahead of the competition. And America in like the 50s and 60s is actually moving out of manufacturing and into like info technologies, entertainment services, things that worked better for. Nowadays, yeah, like if you've got certain degrees will move you up quicker at jobs, but honestly, like, you could go get a bunch of like tech certifications on your own and you're like, I know Java and Python full stack. I'm like, you'll get a job like that. Like, some places will require you to have a bachelor's degree to get that job, but some places don't care. If you get the skill, you get the skill.
I know doctors that said, they've been doctors for years.
Debt from it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about it. If locking you into the system to play the game, like that's what school is designed to. Oh, if you attach that to just starting your adult life being massively, overwhelmingly in debt, it's a prison sentence. It's just, what kind of society are we building? Like, who on earth thinks that's going to produce like productive, happy people that aren't totally overwhelmed and stressed out and like having to just make crappy decisions in life to meet these obligations that they never had a chance to not have?
The other thing that you see is, so not only do we have school being, even though it's not for profit, there's so many that are for profit, that sell you the quick fix, but then we also have students that, well, I had to get into something, because they tell you to go get into college right out of high school. Most of us don't know what the hell we're doing with our life right out of high school.
No way.
I'm gonna go be a corpsman in the Marines, come on. And now I'm sitting here being a nurse going to school 15 years later. It's,
Yeah.
we have totally a different concept of the world until we get into the world, start actually being an adult and making real life decisions. So these people, they go, okay, I go and they get their degree. Okay, well, actually, I didn't want to be a baker after all. Then they go and they get another degree. I'm gonna be a biller. Then they don't want to be a biller. So it's hard because it's like, I definitely want to support people to go get that bigger, better education.
Yeah.
But do we also want to carry people who are becoming lifetime students for the fact that if I can get on that financial aid ride?
Yeah, right. Like, I think, of course, there have to be like guidelines and stipulations and
Right.
stuff, but like, to what you're saying, we've probably all experienced doctors that are just crappy doctors. They don't care about people at all. They seem very uninterested in helping other people. It's like, oh, your parents pushed you super hard in school and you're like, I can be successful. I'll make money. I'll get my medical degree. And they're like in their second year in med school and they're like, I hate this, but they're locked in. Like, that's what they're doing. that's not good for anybody. Like, that's not good for that person. Like, that's not a good life. And it's definitely not good for the people that get stuck in their care. You know, but people that are passionate about that, yeah, they make great doctors, but they seem to have known what they wanted to do and set out to do it. But you know, a lot of people, I think, wind up taking jobs because it's like, I'll be successful, it's lucrative, and that's kind of the end of the list. And you're like, oh, okay, I don't know. I guess that's fine if you want to be like in business management or something like that. But something where it really matters, like law or medicine, is like, hold on, it should be a calling, not an occupation.
You know, a lot of the hard part, things with that is that a lot of people are passionate about that. Sometimes they get into that position, the stress of being there just kills it for them.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I know a lot of the small business owners out in Rosemont have grown up there my whole life. And, the owner of the Wayside Cafe, which has been in family-owned business, I think 70 now, almost 80. Previous owner just handed the business off to her daughter because she was tired of it. Couldn't deal with the stress anymore. She was tired of dealing with, you know, shitty customers, people breaking into her business, and it just killed her dream for it. And
Yeah.
I think that also happens a lot. People look through college just tens of thousands of dollars a day, and then they've still got to work to pay that off and try and actually start their life.
Well, like kind of like real world experience though. It's like, I'm a musician. I originally like went into, that was like my major. I'm like, yeah. And then like I got to know my music teachers and I'm like, oh, I do not want your life. Like, you are sad and miserable and an alcoholic. And like, oh, like, oh, this industry sucks. Like, I just want to play music for fun. I'm not going to do this. Like, I'm out. Conversely, like, you know, so it's a grind. Like, that's not an easy career path. Similarly, you could really love teaching, but then, you know, you get a full-time job at like a giant school and you're like, I might murder all of the administrators. I'm gonna burn the school down. Like, you know, it's just like this, you've sucked all the joy out of anything from doing this because of just a bunch of red tape and baloney. And, you know, I mean, hospitals are the same way too. You could actually really enjoy being a doctor, but all the political stuff you have to deal with. Large organizations in general are just, they're gonna tend to be like that. So yeah, if we could make earlier education much more experiential and give everybody a much broader range of things, you know, I think it'd be so awesome if we could incorporate travel into school more. You know, like, I mean, just regular basic field trips that we used to do would be great. They don't really do that with schools anymore, but you know, like,
Just gardening.
yeah, right. Like gardening, banking class, you know.
Basic skills that can survive.
Yeah, I know some schools still do some home ec stuff, but I'm like, dude, we need to have like, it should be mandatory. Everybody should have to take home ec. Everybody should know how to sew on their own damn buttons and cook an egg and do laundry and like just be a regular adult. But nobody's teaching you that anymore. I mean, maybe if you've got good parents, but you know, we're in the Antelope Valley, so the odds are kind of, they're not in our favor here. We're a feral group of children. Oh, speaking of snake oil, this is actually a great video. You know, talking about the not the yeah, the FDA and all of that. Showing, okay, yeah, there was a real problem in things not being regulated. But it's such a great example of like, oh, there isn't really a perfect solution to these things because the way we regulate drugs nowadays, right? Like where we're like, mushrooms are illegal. And if we find them on you, you're going to jail for having mushrooms. But like billionaires can like pump opioids into people and sell fentanyl to people and like, what? That's okay. Like, it's such an, you know, I don't know if you guys pay attention to any local news, but they last week or earlier this week they raided like all weed shops in Roseman.
I literally,
Oh, dude.
I was driving up Diamond Street, so in Rosemont, there's one pot shop on Sierra Highway, then about 2 blocks up another one. On Diamond Street and Street, adjacent to that, there's 3 of them up the street.
I mean, I've heard. I
I just,
I don't have any personal knowledge.
so I see them all. I was driving up. Complex on the
Yeah.
side, so I started slowing down. Literally, probably 5 to 10 police officers, outside of the building or inside. Dozens of.
They rolled on
cops.
everybody.
And.
And
Taxes. If they don't pay their taxes, they don't want to pay taxes.
that's
Well, even
true.
the ones that do, when I was working out there, I talked to others, one of the ones right up here at Bastrop, and they did everything legal by the books, they still got this. Cops came in with shovels, broke all their cameras, and walked out.
Well, like, and it's easier to like track revenue and like accurately tax people when they are keeping their money in banks. But because the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, this is one of those, it's a kind of a weird safety net, but it comes about in the New Deal after the Great Depression and the Wall Street collapse. That basically, it's an insurance corporation through the government that protects everybody's money in a bank up to $250,000. So if a bank gets robbed and they take all your money that happened to be in that bank, don't worry, the bank will get reimbursed, your money will still be there. If the bank collapses and loses all your money in it, they will, your money's safe with the government. But because cannabis isn't legalized like federally, banks can't take weed money. So that's why you can only pay cash, and they keep all their money in cash, basically. They can't put it in a bank. And so, if there's no external records of your money, then I might be less inclined to pay taxes as well. Like, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just complicated things here. Yeah. Well, here, let's watch this short one. It's interesting.
The original snake oil might just have worked. It all started in the 1800s. While working on the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese laborers used an oil made from the Chinese water snake that they believed would reduce the inflammation on their sore and tired muscles. Word spread of the healing oil. American salesmen looking to get rich made their own, but they used rattlesnake, which didn't have the same medicinal properties as the Chinese water snake. But when the salesman added some alcohol and a little opium, folks couldn't get enough. The salesmen peddled their snake oil at vaudeville-style medicine shows. At the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Clark Stanley, the Rattlesnake King, took a live rattlesnake, sliced it open, and plunged it into boiling water to extract its oil. The crowd went wild. Little did they know, Stanley had stopped adding real snake to the snake oil he was selling. The number of medical cure-alls for sale grew, and ads started popping up in newspapers for countless other concoctions, claiming to treat everything from hair loss to skull fractures. But muckraker journalists were skeptical and began to report that snake oil and the other untested cure-alls caused addiction, overdoses, and deaths. In 1905, Collier's magazine published a series of scathing exposés calling them the Great American Fraud. The public outcry that followed led to the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration to protect consumers from unsafe medication. But modern-day snake oil cures still exist, and you can visit consumerreports.org to learn more.
So, I mean, that's, where the term actually comes from now. Because I hear that term enough. Still, it's basically meant to, denote fraud and just like a fake medical cure. Nowadays, I feel like these are sold through like multi-level marketing schemes, right? It's like,
It's beverage every day. Oh, 10 pounds in the first week.
yeah, exactly. So there's definitely still around. America's got a long history with charlatanism and cons. I want to I'll come back to some of these other things next week, but I think right now I want to watch this. So kind of, just talking about progressive changes. This is one of those tragedies that like plagues America. That's, I mean, more or less forgotten about today because it's 110 years old, but was just like a shocking horror for New York, but for all of America, and became a national, tragedy news story that really furthered along progress in terms of like workers' rights and safety changes.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a man-made disaster, a tragedy of the industrial age, made all the worse because it could have been prevented. Let me set the scene. New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut, and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor, 1 floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was a key moment in the growth of labor unions, particularly the ILGWU, or International Ladies Garment Workers Union. New York City passed measures including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required sprinkler systems to be installed in all factories. It served as a model for state and national workplace safety codes. These measures made American workers safer, but they were too late for the workers who perished one terrible March day at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's just a
Getting elected
horrific
president.
event. People in lower Manhattan jumping to their deaths from a building that's on fire is, eerily like will be replicated 90 years later in a much worse fashion. But it does result in a bunch of forward changes. Maybe the saddest part about this is the ILGWU, International Ladies Garment Union Workers Union. The Triangle workers were part of the original organizing of this huge 20,000 person protest march that took place in New York, I think in 1909. That gathered all of these workers from across this industry in the city to strike and hold out and protest for better working conditions, better pay, safety, all of these things. And almost all of the groups that participated in that got all of the things they were demanding from their employers, except for the Triangle Company. So the very things that they were protesting for, some of them would have saved their lives because yeah, like they were keeping the doors locked so people couldn't sneak out or sneak in late, or the fire escape on the side was like sheet metal, like stapled to the building, basically. Like it was like fake. Like it was like, oh, we met the code, we got a fire escape. It's not real. Like it looks like a fire escape. You can't actually use it. And yeah, and then in a more weird things to think about, right? They're building tall buildings now, 10-story tall buildings. That's, you don't even think about like, oh, I guess they'd have to get new technology to fight fires if they happen up high like that. So this is this is like a significant moment in like labor union history and workers' rights and workplace safety, but also in feminism. You know, because like these women were clearly like disempowered in terms of work and what was going on there. Let me see. One significant change to be noted amongst all these other things like the Model T and the Wright brothers flying and the first radios is Bakelite. It's the first plastic ever invented. How long? Oh, this slide.
The plastics revolution starts with the
And we don't have to watch that. It's not quite the same as plastics we use today. It's like harder and brittle. But this quickly becomes like, oh, people realize we can do a crazy amount of things with plastic and moldings and you know, electrical, you know, shielding and on and on. I think that's another very significant change from like the old world to the modern world. And by modern, I mean the one that they're living in now, not ours. We're postmodern, at least. Would be plastic, right? Like, and there's not like a lot of plastic kids' toys and stuff like that early on, but you know, by the time you start getting around the 60s, really, like kids are getting plastic toys. I mean, Barbie dolls and GI Joes and stuff like that are coming out. Just one small thing that plastics are used for. I think that's probably, we didn't take a break, so that's good to like, we can put a pause in there. And next week, we'll look at like the Russo-Japanese War and the Balkan War. Where's that? It's right down here. And kind of then the buildup for the Great War. Yes. Yeah, not this weekend, but the following weekend. I think it's due on the 24th. Yeah. So, and then in terms of next week, I am going to do class on Zoom because I am flying up to Portland for Comic-Con. My brother and my friend bought a lightsaber company, so I'm going to go help them run the booth. I'm like, all right, cool. Like, that'll be fun. Let me do roll real quick and let me stop this video. I know I'm excited to get to Comic-Con.